Hi, I'm Chris. I'm the CEO of Yardstick. My company measures soil carbon. I am an optimist today because I get to spend all my working hours engaged with other folks who are also trying to fix the problem of climate change, that is. And this is a bit of a selection bias. I know that my closest relationships are not representative of the broader attention of the planet. I wish there were a broader sense that it wasn't just these sort of niche enthusiast parts of broader humanity that are focused on these problems, because it's not a problem that can be solved with a few of us. And that optimism today and yet to come is definitely something I hold in tension every day.
Future Optimist.
You know, when you reference a smaller subsection of the people, you can just say freaks. You can just say ungodly freaks. Clearly,
weirdos.
Weirdos, morons, something's wrong with them.
Yes.
They got a screw loose.
Gluttons for punishment.
Yeah.
Anybody working in market creation
Yes.
is signing up for some suffering.
Anybody who looks at a 2% group and says, I want to be a part of that. That's a special kind
the
of...
group of people that's been categorically ignored for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put my time into that.
Yes, exactly. You know what we could do? We could just spend the rest of this hour talking about MMA, fighting each other. Let's talk about eating steak and fighting. And I think we'll watch the podcast ratings just go through the roof, because that's obviously the template.
TAM expansion, baby, right
yeah,
there.
Exactly.
That's how you
we gotta get these numbers up. But no, it's an honor to have you here, Chris. And I think Yardstick, very cool concept, which is a very unusual concept, if I'm being honest. Or at least it's a concept that doesn't often come to mind. Not for me. I can recognize looking at your materials why it's important, but I'm curious how you figured this out as a sector. Before we jump into that, though, I also am curious about the name Yardstick. When I think about a yardstick, it conjures up memories of Miss Minetti, 5th grade.
Mm-hmm.
I can still hear the sound of the wood just bashing on bloody knuckles.
Yeah.
Kids screaming in the background. I'm sorry, I'll never do it again, Miss Minetti. Why the name Yardstick?
That's a dark brand reference that I'll honor, right? Like you get to have your own memories. Thankfully, you're the first person that's taken it there. More folks are like, oh, I like the sort of folksy measurement.
Quaint. Yeah, it's a very nice
vibe of
yes,
it. Yeah.
No, it's much more folksy.
I have all the credit goes to my amazing wife. Her name is Tori, for the company name. It was probably end of 2020. We were just on the cusp of actually starting the company. And I knew I wanted something that didn't have the word carbon in the name. With all due respect to my fellow climate founder brethren, the world does not need another climate company with carbon in the name. And it also couldn't start with agra, because that also is a well-trod path. And we were looking for things that were memorable, distinct, classic. Was the domain available? Was it trademarkable? And Soil Ruler was a candidate for a little while.
Nice. Okay.
And my wife was like, I got a better idea. Unfortunately, I've not gotten the company to license it from her in some clever way. There's been no kickback there. She contributed that IP out of the goodness of her heart. But here we are a few years later, and folks remember the name because it has neither agra nor carbon in it.
Well, I anticipate one day you'll siphon off several millions of dollars for her. You're going to get cracked down by the SEC. They're going to say, what's that payment for? And you're going to justify it, and you're going to have this whole loophole thing worked out. But
they're going to subpoena this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to say it was intentional, and then you're going to say, I was an idiot. It's a comedy podcast. This guy's obviously a joke. Look at his face. Look at his mustache. But no, it's a really cool concept. And I know you've done a bunch of different concepts before. This isn't your first rodeo, as they say. You've done other things to get into here, from working in design, as I understand it, and worked for a skincare company that was acquired by Grove, which is a behemoth in the sustainable products space. So to get back to the earlier question, how on earth did you discover that this, of all things, was an area worth pursuing? It feels like a niche within a niche.
It is. Yeah. And that is not always a good thing if you are an investor.
I see.
That has been a central opportunity of Yardstick, is that we think we're solving a problem that will expand a thing that has not been happening, but also a central challenge, because you're right. This is a pretty esoteric offering. Soil carbon measurement today matters to a small number of people. Our theory is that the reason why it matters only to a small number of people right now is because it has been incredibly difficult to do since forever. So this is textbook market creation. We think we're going to stimulate a whole bunch of demand by saying, hey, we can do this more cheaply and more easily. I definitely did not see this opportunity myself. I started on third base. I'm not sure Yardstick is a homer yet, but anyway, you get the metaphor.
Yeah, we're mixing a few. We'll land on it by the end.
Most of the work from the 0 to 11 p.m. hour was done by soil scientists in a research capacity, particularly this woman named Dr. Christine Morgan, who is now the Chief Scientific Officer of the Soil Health Institute, SHI, based out of North Carolina, but for a lot of her career was a soil scientist researcher at Texas A&M University.
Do they call that, I have to interrupt you there, do they call that the Soil Health Institute Texas or SHIT? Is that the offshoot?
No, yeah, there's no regional branches yet.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah. She is a Texan by background, and she is the type that would wear that T-shirt as a
super
parody.
close.
So yeah, opportunity for SHI right there. But no, she identified many, many years ago, as many other soil scientists have, that soil carbon is an essentially impactful part of our total function of soil. And when you have something that's really, really important and it's poorly measured, that's generally a bad situation. So she worked on the academic research behind the technology underlying Yardstick for well over a decade before Yardstick came around to be a commercializing company. And so I started Yardstick alongside my co-founder, a guy named Kevin, because of her hard work. And I really focus on this moment of, it's often called translation from the lab to the market. And things by definition have to be ready to be a company rather than be academic research at that point. And thankfully, due to her work and the work of many other soil scientists, it was.
That's incredible. One thing that people don't normally think about, and I've talked to a lot of people with various solutions for sequestering carbon at this point, 200 some interviews deep, many crazy solutions from using algae to sand, all kinds to a rock powder that's being used in the rainforest, so many different things. But what I've never heard anybody focus on yet is the importance of simply measuring the problem.
Yes.
Because again, that's the niche within a niche, the subset within a subset. So why is better measuring or more affordable measuring, 90% reduction in the ability and the cost associated with measuring, why is that significant, and why does that alone lead to better outcomes elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, alone it doesn't, right? Like, unless I have customers that are doing the work of exploring ways of activating soil for climate change, all the measurement in the world doesn't have much impact. The crux of it, though, is, with all due respect to your prior guests, my suspicion is they don't talk about measurement a lot because they know that the total maturity of those technologies is limited. And that doesn't mean that like they shouldn't be doing their thing, right? But imagine being a buyer of their product, right? They have an incentive to tell you like, we got measurement on lock, no concerns,
100%,
and they're no problem. And of course, two things can be true at the same time. They can be right that their product is worth buying, and I can be right that measurement needs improvement, right? So we really focus on the enabling technology angle of soil CDR, carbon dioxide removal, or emissions reductions in agriculture. It is a textbook business strategy question of, do you want to pan for gold or do you want to sell picks and shovels?
Sure.
Right? That is the central strategy choice that Yardstick has made. It means when people find gold, I don't have a lot of gold. I've got a few bucks for the picks and shovels, but it means in the meantime, while they're all looking, if I do my job, I can sell picks and shovels to a lot of different folks. And ultimately, what I see is a market that is incredibly promising, but very nascent in its total MRV maturity, measurement, reporting, and verification. And I hugely admire our customers. And ultimately, I just feel like I would be much more personally fulfilled to be focused on the measurement rigor part of the puzzle and not to feel the commercial burden to go out to the market and tell folks, everybody like, hey, it's ready. Here's a bunch for you to buy. That's not a value judgment on them. I'm a startup founder too, right? If you read my website, it sounds a lot more mature than it actually is in the real world.
It looks great, by the way. You have a great looking website.
Thank you. Yeah. But I think that's the crux of it is I am really drawn towards a market that's defined by super high quality science, something that'll go the distance, especially because we operate in the context of a voluntary carbon market, so-called offsets, that have just had years and years of very high quality criticism around measurement. I like being the team that's going to stand in the gap and to say, hey, yeah, we've learned so much from the failure, especially of avoided conversion in forestry in the past. And man, there's a better way to do it. And I think we've got at least one of a set of technologies that's going to make the better way to do it actually happen.
That's awesome. Have people reacted in a positive way to this? Have people understood the value, or have they seen what you've seen when you're reaching out to these potential customers?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, one thing that's really helpful for us is that every big agriculture company in the world, essentially at this point, has realized, wow, there's a thing happening and we need to be on board with it. So pick your giant ag corporation, guaranteed they've done a press release about their regenerative agriculture program. Usually that means they want the sort of the brand halo of investing in better ways of farming and ranching. And that means that they've probably discovered that measurement is a challenge. So what's great is every single one of them publishes a press release, and then I just email them and they say, hey, my suspicion is you've got a measurement
Are you
problem.
serious
Like,
about
do you want to be
this?
friends?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, I want to be friends.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that they all hire me
Yeah.
right up front. And we're a small company.
Sure.
We're risky in our own right.
Yeah.
We haven't been around for very long. But it's been an incredibly positive response in terms of the confidence I have that we're working on the right problem. I think I have literally met 500 different organizations working in soil carbon over the last 3.5 years. And I would guess that fewer than 10 of them like actively disagree that our thing is a key part of the total puzzle. Again, that doesn't mean that they're like signing a scope of work to hire us for it, but I feel greatly encouraged that folks broadly agree we're working on a key piece of the total MRV puzzle. They find the academic background of the organization credible. They see us building from within the soil science community, which is also we have gotten folks over the line to the science scope of work level of commitment. General Mills is a customer, Organic Valley is a customer. These are organizations that can choose from any one of many measurement technologies in the world. And there are some of the organizations that are best staffed internally to be able to tell the wheat from the chaff among so many emerging technologies for measurement. So the fact that they've chosen to move ahead with us is just, a great credit, not just to awesome work of the Yardstick team, which is awesome nonetheless, but the real awesome rigor and persistence of Dr. Morgan and other researchers in the soil science community prior.
That's fantastic. Well, congratulations on that. Those are some huge early wins. And I know there's others, which we'll get to in just a second here. First, defining some terms for idiots such as myself. We talk about soil carbon stocks. That's a term I've seen. What does that actually mean?
Yeah. Let's talk about soil carbon two different ways. One is at a point basis, and another is on a stock basis. If you go out into any bit of soil, say agricultural farming soil, doing corn in Indiana, you could choose a spot in that farm, and you could characterize soil carbon at that spot. At that spot, you could describe it one of two different ways. You could describe it in terms of concentration. So that's organic carbon as a percentage. If you imagine the total mass of soil is 100%, what percentage of it is this set of compounds that are called organic carbon? So at that point, you may say, hey, the soil that I looked at this spot is 2% organic carbon, which means 98% everything else. Our agricultural soils in the Midwest may range from 0.5% to 3%, 4%. There's outliers, but it's generally a small percentage. That's the first basis. The point basis could be a concentration, percent organic carbon. The second basis could be stocks. If you zoom out, I don't care necessarily about that individual point. I care about the total stock of organic carbon across the acreage of that farm. Could be a polygon, could be a set of polygons, could be the total agricultural soils of America. Stocks are mass in contrast to concentration, which is a percentage. So concentration will say 2% of this soil is organic carbon. Mass says there are this many tons of organic carbon in this soil. So it's a different unit. And often you're moving between this spatial scale of a point basis versus an area basis. That's important because soil carbon has a lot of variability over space. And so if you're only looking at point values, you don't know whether you're describing an outlier or not, right? If you take 80,000 people at Giant Stadium and you pick one of them and that person is 5 feet 9 inches tall, you don't know, is this a stadium full of midgets or of larger people? Similarly, you got to look at a bunch of different pieces of soil to understand the total stock. And so we focus on generating point data, but our ultimate deliverable is to use that point data to describe the stock of carbon and its changes over time.
So for
the best metaphor is always the bathtub.
The bathtub, okay. For a client like General Mills, who must have, millions of acres of farmland, how many data points do they need to be able to accurately figure out what's going on in their world?
So two things drive sampling density. That's really what you're getting at. Like, how densely do you need to sample, right? How many spots do you need to look at? There are two things that drive sampling density. The first is the actual spatial variability of soil carbon. If you imagine two farms that are right next to each other, one has an absolute range of 0.5% to 1%. The other has an absolute range of 0.5 to 4%. The second farm is going to need more samples to capture that variability because the range is greater. That's criteria number one. That's inherent to each location. That's just a given. The second criteria is how precise you want to be. Stocks are a mean and a margin of error. If I'm describing this 40 acres, this million acres, I may tell you the mean is X tons, but really I'm reporting a mean and an uncertainty. Here's my best guess, and then here's how confident I am in that guess. If you want margin of error to be very small, you need more samples. If you can accept it being large, you need fewer. That means Yardstick samples projects on a range of 1 per 2 acres to 1 per 200 acres. It's a big range. It's 2 orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
And that's really reflective of the variability of these two different circumstances. So when General Mills is looking across its supply shed, you're right. It says, holy shit, I got a lot of acres here.
Many
How do I
states.
characterize
Yeah.
all of them? That spatial statistics work is centrally part of Yardstick's offering. We help them do that work to understand how many sample sites do I need.
Is the important figure more the actual percentage, or more are we looking at a rate of change? Are we trying to hit a target here, or is it more like it was 0.5 last year, it's 0.4 this year? What is the most interesting piece of this?
Yeah. So it really depends on what your goal is. If your job is to do an inventory, what you care most about is describing the way things are as accurately as possible. If your job is to make things better, which is what I get more excited about, obviously, the second scenario, changes over time are what are essential. Almost all of our customers are trying to understand changes over time. Usually that's because they're changing management practices in order to influence soil carbon stocks, amongst other things. So a classic circumstance could be General Mills, who is looking at the corn and saying, okay, today I'm getting corn at 1 ton CO2e per bushel of corn. I don't even know if that's a real value. Forgive me to the soil scientists listening who agree that's an insane value. Today it's 1 ton per bushel. Wouldn't it be great if we could get that to 0.9 tons per bushel? Right? So think of it as emissions efficiency, right?
Yeah.
For each bushel of corn, what is the total emissions? And I want to reduce total emissions. I can do that a bunch of different ways. I can reduce the amount of fertilizer I apply. I can reduce the amount of diesel fuel that I burn when I drive the tractor. Soil carbon stocks is another factor in the total emissions picture of what we're trying to do. So there's a zillion different things that people are changing in order to influence soil carbon stocks. But in general, our customers agree that the bathtub has been leaking unacceptably, and we're trying to at least halt the decline in the level of the bathtub. And God willing, even better would be to start filling it back up.
And that's where you get into the regenerative word, right? And
Exactly,
increasing is the goal, not decreasing. We're trying to increase the percentage of organic carbon in the soil.
Yeah, I'd be a little more precise to say our goal is reduced emissions.
Okay.
And changes in soil organic carbon stocks are one component of the total emissions puzzle. For example, if the only thing you cared about is increasing soil carbon stocks, you could just fertilize the shit out of your farm. And you would probably do it. But your total emissions as a farming operation would probably go up because fertilizer is very emissions heavy. So that's where a really high quality methodology comes in. A methodology is a set of guidance that's capturing these measurement requirements so that we don't have these false positives of, hey, look, I increased soil organic carbon. I just did it at the cost of these other things that are really valuable. Directionally though, yes, we want it to go up. We broadly agree that it has been declining. That's bad, both in terms of the climate and in terms of the core function of soil. It's bad in terms of growing corn as well, which means step one is to halt the decline. And then step two would be to reverse it if we can.
Right. Because part of the problem is as land becomes not arable. I mean, that's something that we're doing, right? We're destroying land as we go, and there's only so much land. We can't expand infinitely. So it's not a sustainable option to just burn through all this stuff. We have to figure it out.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. We have increasing population. We have a population that has increasingly so-called middle-class tastes
Right.
around beef.
Like beef, yeah, exactly.
Meat that needs
But
a
they
lot
always
of land.
source, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we have soils that are degraded and less productive and less resilient to changing climate. And so this is actually one of the central excitements of Yardstick, is that we get to operate between the kind of stereotypically coastal, liberal city climate conversation and the stereotypically middle of the country, fundamental, preserve our agricultural economy conversation. That's why the Soil Health Institute is called the Soil Health Institute, because we can speak to either motivation in this story. If your motivation is address climate change, there's solutions out there. If your motivation is just ensuring that you can continue to farm and continue to have a thriving business as a farmer or a farming family, there's a solution here for you, even if you don't care about CO2e.
I love that. I absolutely love that, because I think that's more representative of the actual motivations of at least Americans, but also people worldwide.
Absolutely.
It's not so simple.
Totally.
It's not an us versus them thing. It's we're all in this together. And if your livelihood is coming from your farm, you have a vested interest in ensuring that livelihood continues.
Yep. Especially when, rightly or wrongly, you perceive a lot of the motivation of climate people to be to stop you, to shut you down, to prevent you from applying fertilizer, right? Like, and again, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I will not pretend to know a lot about farming. But before Yardstick, if you had told me hey, is reducing fertilizer use a good idea? I'd be like, yeah, probably. Fertilizer is a big part of agricultural emissions, right? Imagine being a farmer and feeling that perspective from all around and saying, don't you get it? This is how I feed my family. And this is how, to be clear, I grow the corn that's in the ethanol that's in your tank. And you may say you don't like my ethanol, blah, 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 but there you are driving a car. So get off your high horse and stop telling me what to do with my farm. Again, a lot of these, I think the stereotypical perspectives on how farmers think and behave can be really unhelpful. But I think it's actually an important dynamic to acknowledge that when climate people, who are largely my people, treat agriculture as a system that can be engineered into a better reality without a deep consideration for the culture of agriculture, that's folly and that's not going to work. And so I try and at least acknowledge that it's foolishness for me to pretend like everybody in the world inherently values the same things I do and has the same goals.
One thing's for sure, we need to show more respect to our farmers in general, because in case nobody noticed, they're pretty valuable to our survival as a species, and it seems like they more or less always will be. But we have seen that story. I've seen that story in numerous documentaries of a farmer who is doing one thing and then switching to something more sustainable as they themselves go on a path of discovery, such as having plots of land that look barren and turning it into a regenerative type of climate and then watching that soil grow. I think Biggest Little Farm is a great example of that. As or people who have done chicken farming or various other types of farming that have become unprofitable, and they make a change and suddenly they're in business again. So I think there is a willingness on that side as well to say, okay, what is the answer here? Because at the end of the day, they care about feeding their families.
Yep, 100%, as do I, right? And I have the luxury of not worrying about yield of soy in order to feed my family, right? That's a luxury. I don't need to grow any soy in my backyard to feed my family. No. I do not, which means agricultural policy, I don't know, am I really that concerned?
Yeah.
A lot of people literally feed their family with the soy they grow in the backyard. And that's why, to exactly your point about speaking to fundamental economic motivations of agricultural systems, the work of the Soil Health Institute that I've mentioned a few times is really inspiring. They did a big study on what they call soil health practices, but materially the same thing as some of what we've been calling regenerative agriculture. And they looked at 30 farms across, I think, 8 states, and they did a per acre partial farm budget of the operations of these farms. They basically said, hey, what are the economics of adopting these practices? And what they showed is that overwhelmingly, folks just make more money. It's just stronger gross margins per acre.
Makes sense.
You spend less money on fertilizer. You spend less money on tillage. There are trade-offs, and these transitions happen over years. So there's big risks. There's a bunch of uncertainty. That's why these aren't slam dunk transitions that are happening left and right. But I think it's just such a high quality piece of work to show that even if you don't give a shit about climate change and the only thing you care about is gross margin per acre, there is a story here for you.
Yeah. That's what I term on the show win-win-wins. And that's, to me, the most interesting thing. Wins for all concerned. A win for you personally. I want your business to succeed. A win for your customers. A win for the planet. Triple win, triple bottom line. We've heard it stated many different ways, but that sector is definitely one of the most interesting for me. That's the intersection that I find myself most fascinated with.
Totally.
Because
and
when you
most
get
inspiring.
it's the most inspiring, because when you get a sense of that, there are these things that are just purely good or that radiate goodness at every level. That's where stuff gets really exciting. And that's where I too am optimistic about the future. That's one of the areas we mentioned at the beginning. I'm an optimist in that department of things. Other areas, maybe not so much. Or our ability to get away from these finite inputs, like ammonia was used to feed the great boom of China. Tons and tons of ammonia was put in the soil, and that helped feed a population and get them out of extreme famine and starvation. Obviously, ammonia is one of those sacred and rare elements of which there is not much more, or there's not a sustainable means of getting it. And so there are systems that have gotten us here in industrialization and have allowed this level of growth of our species. But I think we're all recognizing that those systems are breaking down, and the systems that got us here aren't necessarily going to get us to the next 50 years or the next 100 years as our population blooms and as everybody suddenly has a taste for steak in India and Africa and all around the world.
100%. Yep. I think the crux of it, though, is who is us, right?
Yeah.
I think the current system actually will take some of us another 50 or 100 years. It's just a question of your level of comfort that it's taking you where you want to go and very much not taking a lot of other people the direction they want to go. That's also why what you're talking about, win-win-wins, really resonates. That's the current optimist piece of my thinking. The future optimist part of my thinking is I think that can sometimes ignore the way that there is power that's being deployed to resist change.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
Yes.
If win-win-win solutions are out there, why aren't they all happening? There's usually a really good reason.
Downward force.
Yeah, absolutely.
Extreme.
There is a force somewhere in the world that, despite what their ESG PDF may say, is actually probably actively working against the thing at the same time.
Yes.
And so I try and hold a paradox of shrewd as a snake and gentle as a dove. Like I think you want both to be wide-eyed enough about the systems of power that will actively suppress anything that threatens their power, and hopefully motivated towards those win-win-win solutions that are there and need a champion or need a catalyst or need an activator. Yeah. They're both a real part of a total set of solutions that I want to see in the world.
Completely agree. And one of the many paradoxes that I hold, or one of the tensions in my own mind, I love people. That's why I do a show like this. I love interacting with individual human beings from around the world, from any socioeconomic status, from any culture. I just really, really enjoy it. I am definitely an extrovert. I get energy from interacting with other people. On an individual human level, I can recognize that the people who participate in these large companies that are applying that downward pressure, there are so many good and well-meaning people, or people on LinkedIn who believe that they're doing good and they're well-meaning and they have families and they care about those families and they don't believe they're actively contributing. And on the other hand, you have these giant corporate behemoths acting according to an entirely different set of principles in the market. And they, as a unit, are causing some negative outcomes, but the individual people that even make up those negative corporations are good people. And that's the kind of stuff that, as we try to talk about these issues, we have to be careful or find the right way to address it and to keep the humanity versus saying, all corporations are evil, which has been the historical thing. It's sort of somewhere in between. And I'll admit that I don't fully understand where to put those boxes sometimes when I'm thinking about these problems.
Yeah, strongly agree. And Yardstick has customers that are big oil and gas companies. There's big oil and gas companies behind most soil carbon stuff in the world. That's a tension that we need to live in every day. I have very high confidence that the individual people that we work with at each of these organizations goes to bed every night and says, I know I'm in the belly of the beast, but I'm affecting change from within. I want to get the aircraft carrier to move 1/10 of 1 degree in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And bless them, right? And they also need to know that they're in the belly of the beast and you don't win against the aircraft
Against
carrier.
the beast.
So how do you hold in tension those
Yeah.
two things, the same way each of us has to in our own right? I love the flexibility
Yeah.
and the adaptability and the freedom of Yardstick as a startup. And considering our scale and the total scope of the problem, are we really doing like anything in the world? Right. That's the tension I have to hold, right? I enjoy the opposite. I enjoy not being within the Borg. I can essentially do and say whatever I want relative to somebody who has to work at a Chevron or a Shell or whatever.
Yeah.
But the downside is they say, yeah, cool, Chris, how many acres are you actually touching this year? And it's a small number compared to the total scope of the world. I think the crux of it is understanding like, what's the role I have to play and how do I simultaneously leave space for the contributions of others and also hold others accountable for the systems that they are intentionally or otherwise a part of, which includes me.
Includes
right?
all of us.
That's not the brand story of startups, but I've got my own Borg that I'm a part of big time.
Same. We all do. We're all complicit in this. We all benefit from it. And our challenges are the same as the farmers, just put in another way. Farmer wrestling with, do I do this and get more outputs and therefore feed my family and sustain my farm? That's the kind of question they have to wrestle with, whether they believe in pesticides or not. There's a certain practical reality. We all have high morals and high ideals. We witnessed the group of the 60s go off and build their commune, and then suddenly they needed dental help and there wasn't a dentist around. It's all well and good until the system breaks down. And each of us has to wrestle with, again, where do we make our money from? Who do we accept payment from? Complicit by accepting money from a certain client versus another? Is there any way to truly escape the system? Or is the best that an individual can do is to move the barge 1 degree off course, regardless of whether you're inside or outside? Because we're sort of all inside at the same time, really, in many ways.
Yeah. And getting outside of it is inherently a privileged experience, right? If you've got enough money or you know how to live in the middle of nowhere, like in many ways, you can at least 98% disconnect. But in that case, first of all, you're alone, which I don't want. And secondly, you've retreated into your own kind of self-aggrandizing, quote unquote, freedom rather than what I am most excited about, which is leaning in to the moral complexity of reality with other people. And that means that I need to deal with the fact that I'm not just alone and I haven't removed myself and I am complicit. But to me, that means I also have the opportunity to participate and engage and learn and contribute. And that's a trade that I will gladly take.
And you get to have that sense of contribution, which is important. Yeah. That's a great motivator.
Totally.
I don't know if you've seen this documentary. I think Vice did it. There's this guy who lives in Alaska in the middle of the remote. There's nobody around. He hunts bears sometimes as a fur trapper. His name was Haimo Korth. And he and his wife are out there alone. And they talk about this week where their daughter visited. And the documentary filmmaker says, "How was it when your daughter was here?" And the woman says, "Yeah, it was good. It was kind of crowded." Like 3 people. 3 people. I was like, I don't know. That's a lot of people. Like a little rough. And we're in these urban areas with millions of people who are like, I like the people. But some people want to get away, and away cannot be far enough away, apparently. I'm not one of those, and I gather you're not either. But you're not completely alone. You've raised, as of this taping, $12 million that we see in terms of Series A funding. But I also saw on LinkedIn that you are a part of a $225 million USDA grant, maybe not the total chunk of that.
Set of grants.
So what's the deal with that USDA grant, and who else does that apply to?
So speaking of Belly of the Beast, this is a program called USDA Climate Smart Commodities. I believe, to their credit, though with complexity acknowledged, at the beginning of this administration, USDA said, I sure wish there were a way to bridge the gap between big establishment ag and climate goals, climate people, whatever you want to call it. And there is. So they figured out this program called Climate Smart Commodities, and it basically says the bulk of our agricultural production is commodities rather than specialty crops, for example, and the bulk of our acres is commodities. I'm sorry, therefore, the bulk of our emissions are also commodities. If we want to interact with the overwhelming majority of our existing agricultural system, and we want to interact with the overwhelming source of agricultural emissions, let's focus on commodities. They went around to all the big ag players, conventional ag folks, and they said, hey, I'm paraphrasing, but they're basically like, hey, as you know, we give tons of hands out. There's tons of support. There's tons of subsidies to your sector. what if we had some extra handouts, but they had to have the name climate change on them? Could you be cool with that? And they got a whole bunch of people to say yes. I think that's like incredibly politically savvy.
Yeah.
They basically said, let me use a tool that you already will accept, subsidies, government support of agriculture, for all the Republican small government bullshit. Agriculture is very happy with their subsidies, as is every other
I know
industry.
everybody's
There's
happy
no
with their
shame in
stuff.
that.
Everybody
Totally.
wants their money from the
Absolutely.
government, no matter who you are.
I do. I'm Yardstick. I got a bunch of money from the government.
we all love
I
it.
love paying taxes
Pay
now.
for my kids' childcare. Come on, give me gas money.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. And so that's what they figured out. They said, how do we put together a very large research project to explore the potential of low carbon intensity commodities? Go back to our bushel of corn, right? 1 ton CO2e per bushel today. How do we get it to 0.9, to 0.8, to 0.7, whatever it can be? And so USDA said, please bring me proposals. We will fund this with $1 billion. Bring me proposals. Make sure a big percentage of that money is being paid to the producers themselves. That's the crux of it. So even if, for example, one of our projects is being led by Organic Valley, the dairy company. Organic Valley is the marquee name on the project. And I don't remember the exact percentages, but something on the order of 60, 70% of the total project funding are incentive payments to the dairies to change management practices. The rationale being changing management practices is risky, right? Like you're only going to do that if you know that, yeah, I want to participate in this research study, but not in a way that bankrupts my business. And that's the crux of this whole program. So it ended up being $3.1 billion rather than one. There's, I think, 140 different projects across all 50 states that touches every major U.S. commodity. And so now there is one or more experiments across every commodity to say, how can we change the way we farm, ranch, forest, breadfruit, like all kinds of crazy commodities that as a resident of Massachusetts, I don't think about. There is now an amazing team of producers and scientists and agronomists who are spending U.S. taxpayer money to figure out how to transform our agricultural commodity economy. I find that really inspiring. It's also squarely the belly of the beast.
I do too, yeah.
And so there's been some very high quality criticism around, hey, isn't this just more of the same like big ag? And the answer is yes. If you want to transform a system, there are different theories of change in the world. But one of them is you got to work with the aircraft carrier if you want to move it. And that's really what this program, USDA Climate Smart Commodities, represents. Yardstick is on, I think, 6 different projects. The total value across all 6 projects when it was announced was $220 million. We're a service provider, so we get a small piece of that.
Right, I saw that.
But it's material revenue for us nonetheless, which is super encouraging.
And validating. And it's, yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
There are some
especially
savvy
because we've
people
got some
out there.
science risk.
There are some savvy folks
and
out
remember,
there.
we're commercializing academic research. So when customers look at my company, they're like, yeah, but is it real? We don't have a track record. We're a young company. So for us to be able to say, whatever is real or not real, we passed the USDA gauntlet, we passed the DOE gauntlet, we passed the NSF gauntlet, we passed the General Mills gauntlet. That starts to be the like social proof that helps folks trust us because understandably, they got to trust us as a measurement service provider in order to go for it.
And you have a lot of very legitimate funders as well and backing from very legitimate organizations.
Exactly. Same thing. They look at those names and they're
clear.
like, hey, they must have done the diligence, right? And
Somebody
they have,
yeah.
thankfully.
Yeah. That's super fascinating, man. I'm very glad that we got a chance to talk. I'm a little bit upset about the fact that we never really landed on a unifying metaphor. I think we're measuring the bathtub with picks and shovels, and we're hitting it out of the park, striking gold.
Baseball.
Lots of things. Something about a bathtub gold leaking. We'll get there, maybe in another episode.
Next time. Yeah.
It's been super enlightening to chat with you and to watch your progress. I'm excited for what the future holds. I know that this might feel like a very odd time where you're not quite yet sure what the next couple years will hold, but certainly from the outside, it appears that you are gaining momentum and gaining steam, and it seems like things are, even if only 1 degree, heading in the right direction. So I wish you more of that.
At the end of the day, I think what helps me hold on is that everybody in agriculture, a little hyperbolic, but everybody in agriculture agrees we have a soil health problem. And everybody in climate agrees that soils are centrally part of the emission sources today.
Kind of a big deal.
And centrally a part of solutions of the future. So if both of those things are true, and I, at least from the inside of Yardstick, really deeply believe that we've got the only technology that's going to solve this problem well at scale, at that point, it's just do your best. There's still a high likelihood of failure because we're a startup and there's lots of things you don't control. But I'm 100% positive we're working on the right problem.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing to change in a startup. To be working on a meaningful problem makes a lot of the other challenges that startup life creates way more tolerable. Because you can sleep at night knowing that you're going to do your best for something that really, really matters in the world. And that's ultimately, I think, again, it's a position of privilege to optimize for that rather than for optimize for feeding my family. And nonetheless, I'm so grateful to be able to feel that every day.
Well, that's a wonderful sentiment. And along those lines, to wrap up a parting thought, I am curious, what is the difference between somebody, we talked about optimism and pessimism, between somebody who's so cynical, and I've been guilty of this myself in the past, so cynical that you can't get out of bed and you're not motivated to do anything. What do you think the difference is that motivates an individual human to take up the charge and to pursue the kind of change they're looking for versus throwing up their hands and saying, you know what, it's hopeless, why even try?
That's a great question. I have never been that other person. I've definitely been that other person in parts of my life for periods of my life. But they've always been acute circumstances. Oh, this relationship is really challenging.
Yeah.
Or my wife had cancer last year.
Jeez,
That
I'm
was
so
really
sorry.
scary.
Oh my God.
Yeah, thank you. She's doing awesome.
Sure.
But my point is I had to feel that way for like 6 months total. And even then, there were many parts of my life that were very life-giving, even though this specific part of my life, which is a centrally important part of my life, but a part nonetheless, was really scary. So I'm not sure I can speak all that much to the difference since I haven't, so to speak, been that other person.
It's kind of been innate in your
materially.
personality, you would say. It's just sort of who you are.
I think it's
maybe.
some combination of innate in my personality and also a natural product of the abundance that I experience in my own life. Like I didn't work for most of what I have. And I'm glad that at an early age, I started being given the tools of gratitude to realize my life is really easy. And that doesn't mean that the parts of my life that are hard aren't really hard, right? Again, both things can be true.
Sure.
And nonetheless, I look around and I'm like, how many of these amazing things is really a product of me being a genius or me working really hard? Man, the modest portion. I think I am a genius, no disrespect to me. And I did work really hard, but yeah, I started on third base to come back to the original.
There you go.
metaphor.
Yes, we are hitting it out of the park after all.
And so I guess if I could, if I had to give a singular answer, it would honestly be gratitude. I think I actively experience the goodness of others in my life, the goodness of my circumstances, the generosity of my parents, the privilege of my color and my gender. And so I look around and I'm like, holy shit, like I've got all the good stuff and I did very little for it. And at least for me, I'm not going to tell other people how to behave, but at least for me, that makes me want to use that, not just for my own sake, but God willing, for the sake of others. And by extension, I think by, again, God willing, participating in their advancement, their liberation, I myself will experience good things as a consequence. That's reinforcing, right? Like I grow when I get to contribute to others.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I think gratitude is one of those buzzwords that's been thrown around so much in the Instagram era. But I've always seen there being a flip side. Again, this duality thing, the whole future optimistic will they, won't they thing. It's not enough to just be grateful, because if you're just grateful, there's an arrogance to that. I think the flip side of gratitude is understanding one's situation in the global ecosystem and then making a decision. Okay, I am grateful. I am lucky. I am privileged. What am I going to do with it? Without the what am I going to do with it? Just, I'm grateful. I'm rich. My life is good.
Yeah.
Warren Buffett might be really grateful. Bill Gates might be really grateful. Gratitude by itself rings hollow if there's not this other piece. And now what? Which I think is just as important. But that's maybe just a semantic nuance. I don't know.
No, I'm totally with you. I think I have struggled to deeply feel gratitude and not take that other step. But I'm totally with you that maybe not the point, but at least part of the point is to both acknowledge what I have and be inspired to use it for the sake of others.
Well, it certainly seems
which
like...
I do imperfectly. And I do that with fear and trembling. I don't pretend like I do that excellently, but it's definitely my goal.
Well, you've taken several stabs at it, and I applaud the chance and the risk and the niche within the niche. I think it's a very noble what you're up to, and I wish you nothing but ongoing success for those who are listening or watching. The website is useyardstick.com. If you have a bad history with a schoolmaster or a schoolmarm, try to get that out of your head, because that is not helpful to this situation.
No,
That's
think
not the
cutesy
point.
measurement
Yes,
metaphor.
cutesy and backed with decades of real scientific research. These are the goals. Chris, it's been an absolute delight talking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you got to get out of here, so I'll bid you adieu and say thanks again. And with that, the official podcast is over.